when you see, I'm going to out them for a moment. When you see Jeff and Phyllis downstairs, even if only for a moment, wish them Nesiya Tova, because they are on their way to do good work in Israel starting next week. There is a classic Jewish story. Technically, it's a children's story, but I don't know how true that is. It goes a little like this. Once there was a village named Rivna, and in the village there was a Rebbe. And Yankala was a Jew of the village. And he went to the Rebbe and he said, Rebbe, it's terrible. My ox has died. Now I won't be able to plow my field. Oi, Rebbe, it's the worst thing that could have happened to me. Maybe yes, maybe no, says the Rebbe. Yankala left the Rebbe's house very confused. Obviously, losing the ox was a bad thing. The next day, he returned joyfully shouting, Rebbe, it's wonderful. It's a miracle straight from God. Yesterday, as I was walking home, I found a beautiful horse at the edge of the field. The horse is twice as strong as my ox. It's the best thing that could have ever happened to me. Maybe yes, maybe no, says the Rebbe. Yankala left the Rebbe's house even more confused. Obviously, finding the horse had been a blessing. The next day, Yankala returned again to the Rebbe's house, weeping. Rebbe, you won't believe it. My eldest son, he's 16 years old, he was helping me. He fell from the horse, he broke his legs. My poor boy, he won't walk for months. He was supposed to find a bride this year. It's the worst thing that could have ever happened to me. Maybe yes, maybe no, says the Rebbe. And Yankala was furious. How could the Rebbe be so heartless? And the very next day, the Cossacks came to the village. And they took away all the boys who were old enough to fight, even as young as 15. And they took them all to the Tsar's army. And the Jews of Rivna knew they would never see their children again. And the only boy who remained was Yankala's son, because he lay in a bed with broken legs. And Yankala understood the Rebbe's wisdom. Things happen in life, and we cannot always know if they are for our good or if they are for our ill. And the story closes by saying, all we can do is trust in God. This week, a lot happened. But there are three things specifically that happened which brought this story to my mind, because some of them were shared with me with the phrase, you know, it's a good week for the Jews. And when I hear that phrase, especially, it causes my ears to perk up, because how do you know? Who can tell? Like a dead ox, or a new horse, or a broken leg. In this crazy mixed up world we find ourselves in right now, is it a blessing? Is it a curse? Maybe yes, maybe no. The first case, none of you missed it, I know, is that of Harvard University president, Dr. Claudine Kaye. Dr. Kaye, as you recall, was one of 3 university presidents called before US Congress several weeks ago. And during her contentious testimony, President Kaye was, like her other Ivy League counterparts, unable to, quote, unequivocally say that calls on campus for the genocide of Jews would violate the school's conduct policy, end quote. And in a massively shared social media clip, Kaye can clearly be heard stating that such a thing would, quote, depend on the context, end quote, and that when, quote, speech crosses into conduct, that violates our policies, end quote. Her answer faced swift backlash from across the political spectrum, including condemnation from the White House. And Kaye tried to walk back her statement and apologize. And in an interview with the student newspaper at Harvard, The Crimson, she said, what I should have said, what I should have had the presence of mind to do in that moment was to return to my guiding truth, which is that calls for violence against our Jewish community and that threats to our Jewish students have no place at Harvard and will never go unchallenged. But it was not enough. It was not enough to control the damage, and this week she resigned. Her tenure as president of Harvard is the shortest in the university's history, 6 months and 2 days. And she joins President Liz Magill of the University of Pennsylvania, who also was forced to resign. And following her resignation, there were many thought pieces from different corners of the academy and the Jewish world, and of course, the chorus of our lives, which is the internet, social media. And some of those voices said things like, 2 down, 1 to go. And another one was, victory against anti-Semitism and anti-Semites. And of course, as I told you already, one that I heard was, it's a good week for the Jews. While others saw that this was playing into tropes and stereotypes about Jewish power, and fearing that Jews will be blamed for a successful and articulate black woman losing her job. Of course, the age-old trope that we used, our dirty money and our influence, as that one of Gay's most vocal critics is the Jewish billionaire and Harvard alumni Bill Ackman, and that we used his influence and wealth to fire her. And still others lamented that that initial hearing was obviously and clearly a political hit job. It was a trap that was set by the American far right, and it was bait that both the Jewish community and the academic world took, and that our anger and our trauma has been co-opted in a battle against higher education. And amongst all of those different perspectives, those various talking heads, those various perspectives, I found an article posted in the Jewish Journal by Hen Mazik. And Mazik, who is an Israeli social media influencer and Jewish advocate, was actually here at Holy Blossom just a few months ago. And he says, one would assume that I, an outspoken voice for Jewish civil rights, would be thrilled that she lost her job. And yet I think at my core I'm simply too much of an idealist to be happy with this result. Dr. Kaye was more than her opinions on the conflict or the way she dealt with the incredible tension that mounted afterwards. I didn't want her to lose her job over her reaction to anti-Semitism. I wanted her to start a dialogue with the Jewish community and to find a way to make her Jewish students feel safe. Mazik continues his thought piece by stating that there is probably nothing to celebrate here. She will go on with her life, and now there are going to be even more people in the world and on her campus who will have another story that, quote, stigmatizes us as oppressors when all we wanted was a bit of justice. And in conversation with a generation where the narrative of oppressor and oppressed is the whole conversation point, Mazik makes it clear that Dr. Kaye losing her job will not repair, will not change misconceptions about the Jewish people. It will only reinforce them. And so could this have been avoided? Could there have been some form of repair or education or rehabilitation made? Did we have to play the role? We don't know. There was a choice between retribution and education. And in the case of Dr. Kaye, the choice that was made was retribution. And we don't know if it was the right thing to do. Was her forced resignation a blessing or a curse? Was it good for the Jews or bad? Maybe yes, maybe no, says the Rabbi. This week, the Israeli Supreme Court overturned 2 key pieces of legislation passed by the Netanyahu coalition. These judicial overhaul bills, or as they are known by their opponents as the judicial coup bills, were massively divisive in the Jewish world. The single passed piece of legislation that was overturned would have reduced the power of the Supreme Court by implementing a basic law which would have made it impossible for the Supreme Court to use reasonableness in its rulings to negate laws which are passed by the Knesset. And this, amongst a series of proposed laws designed to, quote unquote, rein in the judiciary, prompted, as I'm sure you remember, months of protest in Israel's streets and abroad, and shed light on the serious fracture between Israel and diaspora Jewish communities, and of course, significant tensions inside of Israel itself. And this week, in an 8-7 decision, the 2 laws that were passed by the coalition, one over reasonableness and the other over the prime minister's right to recuse himself from cases where he has a vested interest, which is to say corruption, were both struck down or placed on delay. And I am not a lawyer, and I know that some of you are. So correct me if I'm wrong, but this is my understanding, that when a law is passed which limits the power of a government body to use a tool to determine whether or not a law is legal, and then that same power is used to negate that law, which would then neuter it, you enter into what is called a constitutional crisis. And this constitutional crisis doesn't happen by accident. The authors of the past legislation openly admitted that at the time, they had the power, they had the clear majority in government, the coalition that was not going to break. This was the stated intent from the beginning. They were open to causing a constitutional crisis on the assumption that they would then pass laws and appoint judges and appoint ministers that would support their position and reshape the law from the very ground up, making it impossible to undo the changes that they were enacting, since what they were going to be changing was the very foundational basic laws of Israel and the ability to change basic laws. And this open desire to permanently change these laws is why it is called by its opponents a judicial coup, because once it happens, it cannot unhappen. And on any other day, in any other world, right now, Israel would be tearing itself apart, fighting internally this long-feared, long-awaited legal battle that will determine the very character, the very fate of the state, and ask the question for democracies worldwide, is a simple majority enough to change who you are at a constitutional level? Except, of course, we can't do that right now. We can't have that fight right now because we are at war with an external enemy who is not just seeking to reshape the state or manipulate it for its own power or gain, but who actively want to see it annihilated and every one of its citizens murdered. And so thank God, I guess, that at least for the moment, out of necessity, out of unity, the Israeli people are focused on the battle which needs to happen now and not the battle that awaits them in the coming months and the years and the judiciary and the courts and the polls and the Knesset. And yeah, some of those rifts are opening again, but it would be more accurate to say that they never really closed. But what's different now is that Netanyahu's once unshakable coalition, with its extremist Kahanism proudly on its sleeve, who was so certain of its power and so certain of its majority, so certain of its ability to govern and rule without repercussion, is considered by everyone paying attention to be a lame duck. It's on its way out. It is doomed at the next election because it could not protect its citizens on October 7th. And the damage it did to national cohesion leading up to that moment has ruined the potential future of that leadership. And so here we are. The constitutional crisis that was inevitable has come, except it hasn't, because we can't afford to have it right now. And is that a good thing or a bad thing? Will that save us? Will that harm us? Is this our blessing? Is this our curse? Is what the Supreme Court this week, they're ruling, is it, quote, good for the Jews? Maybe yes, maybe no. And finally, in southern Lebanon this week, Saleh al-Aruri, the deputy leader of Hamas and the architect of terrorism in the West Bank for several decades, was killed in a pinpoint alleged Israeli airstrike along with 7 other Hamas commanders. And al-Aruri was the terror group's point man with the Iran-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen, and he orchestrated terror activities in the West Bank from overseas, and he oversaw all Hamas military activities in Lebanon, including the firing of rockets into Israel. And infamously, he was also the architect of the kidnapping and murder of 3 Israeli teenage boys, Naftali Frankel, Gilad Sha'ar, and Ayal Yifrach, a case that happened around a decade ago. I remember it too clearly, as it happened just days after I moved back to North America from Israel. And I still remember that terrible summer. I can still see those 3 boys in my mind. I still remember them getting into a car, taking the ride from a wrong driver, from an intersection that I had stood at and passed dozens and dozens of times. And I also remember the poor Palestinian boy, Mohammed Abu Qadir, who was burned to death by settler terrorists just a few days later as an act of retribution. And it was this man's fault. Salah al-Aruri. And his crimes and cruelty is it's too large a list to go into. And immediately following his death, every single diaspora Jewish professional who has been paying attention could have set the clock by the number of minutes it's going to take to receive an email from the Federation. And sure enough, inevitably it arrived warning us that as a result of this assassination, there is a greater chance that the Jewish community of insert wherever you live here is now likely to be targeted for violent revenge killings by either Hamas or its friends or the people who look to them for inspiration. And while there is no intelligence to suggest that your particular community will be targeted, maximum vigilance will now be required, and all current increased safety measures must be continued. And here, don't get me wrong, there is no comparison of cause and effect. There are people in this world who are dedicated to our erasure, to our destruction, to our violent end. And that is the choice that they have made. And I don't weep a single tear when they are slain. And I also do not actually believe, even for a moment, that my safety or any of our safety has been decreased because of their death, because their entire existence, by their own admittance, was dedicated to ending my safety. Every breath that I take right now is because of their lack of ability and their lack of opportunity, not their lack of will. The only thing has changed is an increase of will, not an increase of opportunity or ability. So in regards to this particular case and the killing of this man, it's not whether or not that was good or bad for the Jews, but rather the greater question which arises from the war, which continues to shift and expand, which was killing this man and his cronies in a country that is kind of at war with Israel, but not openly at war with Israel, was going into Lebanon. Good or bad for the Jews. And the story of Israel and Lebanon, and the story of the two wars between them and the influence of Iran and Hezbollah and how Hamas works into this is not actually a sermon I can give because it's a lecture series. It might actually be a master's degree. But what you need to know today is that when Israel takes a calculated risk, they take a risk. And that risk is, of course, that in a worst-case scenario, a new front in the war will open. And some people might tell you that there already is a northern front, and that you're just trying to put pillows back into a suitcase or into a pillowcase that you ripped open. And others people will tell you that the northern front wouldn't be like the front in Gaza because it's more a traditional war. And other people would tell you that if Iran was going to let Hezbollah go to war, they would have done it already. And there's a lot of other opinions. And the Israeli intelligence services and the Mossad and the IDF, they all need to make their choices, and I'm not in that room any more than any of you are, to the best of my knowledge. But at this time, when rockets and drones and mortars are regularly crossing from Lebanon into Israel, one has to assume that they are making these calculations with a level of uncertainty, with a level of risk. Will killing this man tip the scales? Will it cause more pain than it solves? Is this momentary victory worth the risk? Will this be our strategic advantage or our historic blunder? Will it be our blessing? Will it be our curse? Maybe yes, maybe no. And I will just say that since October 7th, I have gotten into the very bad habit of checking the Israeli news first thing when I wake up. And the very first thing that I saw when I woke up this morning was that 40 rockets were fired into northern Israel this morning in response to the assassination of this man. And they won't be the last rockets that are fired in regard to this man. But let's return to the story. The children's story with the Rabbi and Yankala and the litany of woes and the blessings. Believe it or not, that's the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy sets forth a theological concept that good things happen to good people and that bad things happen to bad people, and that's just the way the world works. And our sages, our rabbis read that and they say, okay, we're not actually sure that's the way the world works, so maybe bad things happen to good people because it will lead to a good thing happening to a good people. Maybe good things happen to bad people because it'll lead to a good thing happening to a good person later on. Maybe if your entire life is suffering, you're just getting the suffering out of the way for the next world. Maybe, you can see that they're trying to make sense of an often senseless world. And one of the most important lessons I learned in rabbinical school was from Rabbi Julie Schwartz, who is the head of our chaplaincy program. And she said, you don't answer questions of suffering with theology, even when people want you to. When they turn to you and say, why is my partner dying? Why is my child sick? Why did I lose my parent far too young? And this is her quote, there are rabbis who will tell them God has a plan. Please do not be one of those rabbis. They have heard that God has a plan before. If they are asking you, it's because they need you to love them in their pain, not for you to tell them that God has a plan. Looking out into the Jewish world today, these three stories reminded me of her. It reminded me that as a people and as a nation, but more than that, as a family, as a global family composed of innumerable smaller families, we are a family that is suffering. And often we are wondering and we are turning to our leaders and our teachers and our parents, our fonts of wisdom, our rabbis, asking, is it a blessing what happened today? Is it a curse? What happens? It's so hard to tell. And when they come to you, I don't mean me, I mean you, because I'm sure you are getting some of these questions too, from grandchildren, from friends, from family. When they say, I can't believe what's happening, what should you say? That you aren't suffering because this is all part of a divine order and that good will come out of it? Or that whatever small comfort you took in someone else's defeat is a curse because there's going to be consequences that come out of it? I think the only thing that any of us can do is what Rabbi Schwartz teaches us, which is to love each other, to love your Jews, to love your family, to love your Israeli friends, to love our people in our pain, to love them so much that you refuse to give up on them, and to love them so that you work for their growth and that you work for their healing, and to love them so that you protect them with every chance you get. And God can worry about whether or not it's a blessing or whether or not it's a curse. So let me tell you the opposite of a children's story. Yankala comes to his rabbi, distraught. He says, the ox died. I found a horse. It broke my son's legs. And now the Cossacks have stolen all the young men of the village. And only my boy remains. What should I do, Rabbi? And his Rebbe embraces him. And together they weep, and they are brokenhearted. So together they go into their village, and they help their people. Shabbat Shalom.